But people don't forget that that generation, they studied, man. One thing about that generation of people, right? I think dancehall generation, they tend to imitate and relate to each other and study each other very closely. But the generation of Bob Marley and ska, they would sit down and listen very closely to the music of American civil rights R&B. They studied Sam Cooke and tried singing like Sam Cooke. That's the beautiful thing about Joe Higgs, right? He would say, okay, now right now, I want you to do an Otis Redding, just Otis Redding style, right? And they would sing it like that. They'd say, okay, now do a Sam Cooke style. If you walked up to Bunny Wailer and Bob Marley and say, do an imitation of Sam Cooke, they would do it like that, because that's how they trained. So it was about imitating the African-American civil rights generation people. Other things too, but primarily that. People like Sam Cooke, Otis Redding, Smokey Robinson, right? And most certainly, in my view, the most influential American singer on roots reggae, Curtis Mayfield, right? Now, Lucky Dube, he manifested that primary tendency, in fact, that obsession that African reggae musicians still have. And that is, they were obsessed with imitating either Bob Marley or Peter Tosh. If you know anything about African music, one of the things that's a little bit annoying about it is that they sound so much like Bob Marley and Peter Tosh. Good examples of this are people like Majek Fashek. Anyone know Majek Fashek? Right? Majek Fashek, Victor Essayet, a guy from Ghana named Rocky Dawouni. These are brilliant and wonderful musicians, but you listen to them and all you can hear is the ghost of Bob Marley and Peter Tosh in how they have trained their vocals, right? And there are many, 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 many others, African roots music. So that's why people have thought, well, you know, he sounds too much like Peter Tosh. If you ever listen to Lucky Dube, you're hearing an African imitation of Peter Tosh. People say he never went beyond that imitation, right? And that it was Peter Tosh that he imitated is really eerie, considering that the death of Peter Tosh getting shot really prefigures or kind of announces Lucky Dube's murder generations later. In my view, it wouldn't be until Ivory Coast singers like Alpha Blondy, right, where you'd see a non-Jamaican voice, not music, the voice, emerge in reggae. But Alpha Blondy, in my view, he's only John the Baptist, right? The person he really announced is someone who's very popular now, Tikin Jaffa Cody. I think he's an artist who really has transcended roots reggae from Jamaica and helped create something that is totally indigenous and native to West Africa. He's also taken the level of political controversy that no reggae musician has had since Bob Marley. Right? But back to Lucky Dube. He may not have transcended Peter Tosh and imitating Peter Tosh, but that's less important to me than a couple of other things. For example, people forget, people don't even know that before Lucky Dube even started twisting up his head, right, and going dread or listening to reggae, he was already famous in South Africa as a Zulu musician. He recorded 6 albums of a kind of music called Mbakanga, right? And I like to remind people, 6 albums is not a hobby. He was very serious about Mbakanga, right? He did 6 albums of a genre of music that was specific to Zulu people. It was also very popular in South Africa. At the time, reggae made no money. Nobody wanted to, reggae made no money. Mbakanga made money. And so he was very successful as a Mbakanga singer, right? But he chose to go to the route that made no money, right? And whenever someone chooses something that makes no money, that's when you have to ask some questions, right? He was famous for Mbakanga, but another thing about Lucky Dube, before he even did reggae, he released a rap record under the name was Hansi, right? He did all that before his first album in 1984 called Rastas Never Die. Now this is not to put him down. I think this is powerful and important to understand why reggae works for someone who's making a choice, right? Rastas Never Die came out in 1984 and it was banned by the South African censors, right? And then of course his international breakthrough album was called Slave, right? So start thinking, why is he calling it Slave, right? Coming from South Africa. Right? Now, even at the height of his popularity in South Africa, as a reggae artist, when he was the dominant reggae artist in Africa, most of his fans in South Africa kept wondering, why are you doing this weird Jamaican thing? Most people didn't want to hear it, right? Even when he was most popular, a lot of the people who bought his Mbakanga said, go back to Mbakanga, we miss you, right? But in his words, he changed because he wanted to reach the world, he said. He wanted to reach the world. With Mbakanga, he said, all he could have been was a Zulu. Right? A Zulu musician and a tourist musician. And he didn't want to be a tourist musician. He didn't want people, and then people would say, well, you're ashamed of being Zulu. Right? And that's how it works on the continent. You imitate the Jamaicans, you imitate African American hip hop, it's not, ooh, rebellious. No. It's considered colonialism. You're being brainwashed by the West. Yes. You should be Zulu. You should do Mbakanga. You should speak in your traditional language. You should dress in your native gear. Right? Dreadlocks was not seen as rebellious. It was seen as brainwashing. Right? For a lot of South Africans at the time. So he clearly wanted to speak to the world. And the only way for an African to speak to the world was by imitating a Jamaican fantasizing about Africa. Ooh. I think that's quite heavy. Right? So people tend to think, by the way, that reggae becomes popular in in Africa in 1980, which is when Bob Marley played in Harare. Right? Not true. Reggae had been trickling into the continent for a long time, certainly in the blue beat ska era, because a lot of West Africans and South Africans were in London because of the colonial power and the colonial experience, and they were mingling with Jamaicans and listening to the ska music, right? Ska and blue beat, just like they were listening to R&B, and most importantly though, I think more importantly than reggae, right, this could be another lecture, was rumba and salsa, right? African music is more influenced by rumba and salsa than by reggae or hip hop. But that's another lecture, which I'm happy to give. You know? Okay. So, for Lucky Dubé, reggae had already started trickling through Africa from an earlier generation. West African students and immigrants had brought it back because for them it was the music of immigration. Right? It was the music of migration from place to place, and the Africans in London listened to music talking about roots, and they understood it, not because they were in Africa, but because they were in London, right? And that's why they brought reggae back to Africa. Selector? One more section, I'm not done yet.